Hey, folks, welcome back. Today we are getting into Unit 5. To start with, in Unit 5, we're going to get into what I mean or what that word means there macroeconomics. Just to give a brief explanation, and basically, these next two units, Units 5 and Unit 6, will revolve around macroeconomic concepts. The macroeconomic concepts that we'll be looking at here are macroeconomic goals, and in connection to that, the different ways we measure if we're hitting these macroeconomic goals. And the first tool that's used to see if we're meeting the first macroeconomic goal is what's called gross domestic product. So we'll look more in depth into that one. And you notice that on the screen here it says part 1. Part 2 is going to be the math behind finding different data points within gross domestic product. So that's in part 2. That's a separate video that will come after this one. All right, let's get going. So to start with, we're taking a look at the idea of macroeconomics. It is the study of the economy as a whole, or the economy of a country as a whole. So all countries take a look at how the overall economy is doing. And so when we do this, what we do is we take a look at how consumers are doing, how we're consuming as a whole, how producers as a whole are producing, and that's where gross domestic product comes in. And we look at other concepts and topics within macroeconomics. You can see a few there. These are just a small portion of it. Economic growth, which we measure with gross domestic product. Business cycle, okay, fiscal policy, monetary policy, which we'll be looking at in Unit 6, and inflation, which we deal with in the last topic in Unit 5. We also look at unemployment, another topic that's covered in macroeconomics. Now, also in macroeconomics, as I mentioned before, economists will see if a country is hitting their macroeconomic goals. And most modern economies have three major goals. The first one and most important is economic growth, which I mentioned before, and it's measured through the real GDP growth rate, real gross domestic product growth rate. We'll see how that is found in our second video for this topic, part 2. The second goal we'll look at, topic 2, is reaching full employment. I'll explain what that is, and that's measured by the unemployment rate. And then the third goal, price stability, which means basically we don't want to have a lot of wild-ranging price level changes in a short amount of time, and we measure that through what's called the rate of inflation. So we'll look at that in topic 3. So we'll be focusing on the U.S. When we look at these indicators, we call these goals, the real GDP growth rate, the unemployment rate, the rate of inflation. We call these economic indicators because they indicate whether or not we're reaching these goals. So we'll be taking a look at the U.S., for example, as we get to know these economic indicators and the goal rates that show that we're hitting these goals within the U.S. All right, so real brief intro into the idea of macroeconomics. We're going to focus in on gross domestic product, which eventually will allow us to identify economic growth and if we're hitting our goals for economic growth within the U.S. All right, to start with, looking at gross domestic product, I'm going to refer to it as GDP from here on out. It's a little easier. So what we're looking at really is productivity within a country's borders. We look at the total monetary value, so how much the total price that goes into the selling of all new final goods and services that are produced. So I shouldn't say selling, all new final goods and services that are produced within a country's borders, because we count goods that are newly produced, and services newly produced but may not have been sold yet. So produced within a country's borders within a given time period, usually comes out every 3 months, or what we call a quarter of a year. All right, just as an aside here, the U.S. has the largest gross domestic product in the world, 27 trillion, 360 billion. um, rounded gross domestic product in 2023. We that allows for the U.S. to be called the largest economy in the world because that's how we measure size of economy as productivity, production of new final goods and services. Within gross domestic product, you can measure it a few different ways. The approach we're going to use is expenditures approach. It's the most straightforward. And essentially, we're just adding up the monetary value of goods and services produced that are consumed by the four big sectors of consumers. Households, so consumption, businesses when they buy new final goods and services, that's called investment. It's not financial investment, it's not stocks and bonds. It's when businesses buy new final goods and services that's going to make them more productive in the future. We'll talk more about that in a second. Government buys goods and services, so that's another portion of this expenditures approach. And then net exports, and that is foreign consumers buying U.S. made goods. So we add this all together. So we measure spending. So think expenditures as spending. So we're measuring the spending that's done on goods and services produced by these four sectors of the U.S. economy. All right. Now, when we look at these sectors in turn, a couple different things to pay attention to. One, consumption. C, new final goods and services, as I said, but households and individuals purchase. So these are new final goods and services produced that are eventually purchased by households and business firms, or households and individuals. They have to also be produced in this side, the U.S., as you see there. Okay, it's the largest component of the U.S. GDP and most economies. So it can be anything: new clothes, groceries, some new electronics, haircuts, oil changes, etc. Okay, the I stands for investment. As I stressed before, this is not financial investment like buying stocks and bonds. This is the purchase of new final goods and services by businesses to increase production. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind. So if a business decides to build a new factory, decides to buy a fleet of delivery vans, decides to buy a whole bunch of new computers, that all would fall under investment. Okay, a couple things, and you'll see this again just as a reminder. New houses. This is one of those oddities that you need to keep track of because you will be asked about what's counted and what's not counted in the US's GDP. The production of a new house is counted under investment. It seems, though, that a new house, the value of that new house, should be counted under consumption, but it is not. So just keep that in mind as you go through your work, your formative, and prep for your summative. And then also, I mentioned earlier that we count goods that are produced but not sold. We call that inventory. Okay, so any good or service produced but not sold is considered inventory and is counted in GDP under investment until it is sold to whichever final consumer. Could be households, individuals, or businesses, government, foreign consumers, whichever it goes to. But if it's produced but not sold, we count it because it has been produced, and it is counted under inventory or as inventory under investment. Okay, moving on. Government spending is G. The amount of new final goods and services that any level of government buys. So that could be local government, state government, federal government. Okay, it is the fastest growing component of the U.S. GDP, and this can be a wide range of things. Again, there's a number of different forms of government within the U.S. So, new military spending by the federal government, public school spending by the state of Minnesota, let's say, or even the district, East Carver County District, spending on road construction in a county, new county road, let's say, that would within Minnesota, that would all be counted. And then finally, net exports. The amount of new final goods and services made in the U.S. that foreign consumers purchase minus, this is key, minus the amount of new final goods and services made outside or produced outside the U.S. that U.S. consumers purchase. So we don't count imports. Those are goods that are coming into the U.S. that were produced somewhere else. Those are subtracted out from net exports. And we do count any goods that were produced in the U.S. that were consumed by foreign consumers. So a couple examples here. Cranberry juice produced in Wisconsin, then sold and shipped to China. That's one example. Overall, net exports is negative for the U.S. We just buy more goods coming in from a foreign country than foreign consumers buy of our goods. Okay. And that's been the case for a very long time. So there are 4 components. Okay. Now, the key question you'll run into outside of your math questions is when it comes to GDP and finding GDP is, well, what's included, what's not counted. Okay. What's counted, what's not counted. So here are a few reminders. I just went through some, so you should be able to remember some of these from just a few minutes ago. Consumption, you can see oil changes, childcare services, U.S. produced goods like new vehicles, new clothes, food and beverages, regardless of brand, as long as they're produced within the U.S. and consumed by individuals or households. Okay. Again, the largest part of the expenditures approach to finding the U.S. is GDP. Investment, okay, new factories, new delivery vans, as I said before, new computers purchased by a company make them more productive, regardless of brand, as long as it's produced within the U.S. Okay, and the reason I say regardless of brand is because we do have some foreign companies, so companies based outside the U.S. that have production plants within the U.S. that produce the good inside the U.S. and sell it in the U.S. That's why I say regardless of brand. Remember that new houses are counted in investment. Okay. Inventory is counted in investment, as I mentioned before. And you can see the examples here, very similar to what I gave you previously. Okay. Under government spending. Okay. So public school spending on goods produced in the U.S., spending on road construction, all that goes into the road construction. Well, that's as long as it's produced within the U.S. And then finally, net exports. I showed you the example of cranberry juice, but you also have Panasonic solar cells that are produced in Nevada and then sold and shipped to Italy, which actually does occur. That's another example of net exports. Now, Panasonic and some electronic companies aren't based in the U.S., but again, like I said, they have production facilities in the U.S. and then sell those goods they produce overseas. That's counted in the U.S. So just a few more examples there for you. What's not counted in the U.S.'s GDP? Okay, intermediate goods. These are goods that are not the final good purchase. They are the ingredients. So they're goods used in the production of a final good. Okay. So, for example, let's say that there's a Apple has a production facility inside the U.S., or Microsoft has a production facility inside the U.S. And what happens is they have these microprocessors, right, that go into does all the work inside a tablet or iPad. So when Apple in this case buys those microprocessors, that value of those microprocessors isn't counted in the U.S.'s GDP, even if it was produced in the U.S., because the price of those microprocessors will be reflected in the final price tag of the iPad. Okay, and so we account for that, all the costs of all these intermediate goods in the $599, whatever it is, to purchase an iPad. That's reflected in there. Okay, just keep that in mind. Used goods. Used goods, we only count the value of a good or service produced when it's newly produced. Okay, that's why we say produced, newly produced. So even though we can sell goods a second, third, fourth, however many times, it's only counted in the U.S. because it can only be produced once. So it's only counted in the U.S.'s GDP once. All right. No used goods counted. Underground production, black market, anything that legal sale, sale of illegal or stolen goods falls under this. Even if these guns are produced, if they're are goods, whatever they may be, illicit goods, we don't count those. We can't track it very well. It's not easier to know for sure exactly how much money coming in, so that's not counted. Financial transactions. This is where I'm trying to emphasize the idea that business financial investment is not counted. Okay, financial transactions include the sale of stocks and bonds, which students have a tendency to think it falls under investment and counted in GDP, but it is not. Remember, GDP measures production. And so businesses buying new final goods, that's anything like that, any example of that is counted, but not the sale of stocks and bonds. Okay, a few more. Household production, any type of service you do basically to your house that you don't sell, don't get a final price tag on, is not counted. So you might buy all the ingredients, you might buy food at the grocery store, and all that, the value of that food is counted, but the work to use it to make dinner is not counted because no money's exchanged for that, right? Nobody pays me to make dinner or pays my wife to make dinner at home. So we can't put a value on it. Transfer payments are payments of money where no new final goods or services produced. So money goes out, but nothing comes back in the form of new final goods or services. Okay. We have both public transfer payments and private. Public transfer payments is money that the government gives out. Payment made by the government to an individual, like Social Security payment, welfare payment, grants given to students to go to school, all that kind of stuff is a public transfer payment. Private transfer payment is when one individual gives money to another individual. Okay, could be as simple as you giving money to a buddy for or your parents giving you money to go to a movie, or it could be as complex as you sending money overseas to a family member in a different country. Either way, they're considered transfer payments. No new final good or service is produced, so we don't count it in GDP. And then finally, imports. I mentioned this already. Part of the definition of GDP is within a country's borders. So if something is produced outside the U.S. but comes in and we buy it, it was produced outside the U.S. So it can't be counted within. It can't be counted in the country's GDP. Okay, Japanese produced cars sold in the U.S. would not be counted in the U.S.'s GDP because they were produced in Japan and sent over here. All right, now in connection to what's counted, what's not counted, here are a few examples of questions that have shown up in the past on summatives. We talked about new house, that's counted under investment. Okay, new house construction, purchase, whatever the value is, goes under investment. Okay, the car I purchased that was produced and sold in the US by a Japanese company. Now pay attention to this one. The car was produced in the US, so it is counted in the US's GDP. Okay, even though it was produced by a Japanese company, as long as it was produced within the US's borders, it's counted. So it's counted under consumption. A box of German-made chocolate sold in the US. Notice where it was made, in Germany. So German-made chocolate can't be counted in the US's GDP, even if it was sold in the US, because it was produced in a different country. This is considered an import. The steel purchased by Chevy to be used in the production of their trucks. Okay, the key here is we have a good steel that is not the final good. The steel is not going to Chevy, and Chevy is not the final purchaser of the steel. The steel is going into a car that someone else is going to buy, probably an individual. So this is considered an intermediate good, and the value of that steel, however much it costs to put into the production of a truck, will be reflected on that truck's price tag when an individual buys it. Okay, a Ford F-150 produced in Michigan and sold in Brazil. Michigan's in the U.S. Brazil is a separate country. That would be counted as net exports. And then the last one, a welfare check sent out by the Minnesota state government. This is considered a transfer payment. The person who gets the check isn't sending anything new or final back to the U.S. that they produce, or back to the state government that they produced. Okay, they're just getting that money and then eventually will spend it. So this is considered a transfer payment. You'll see more examples and more questions of you in terms of what's counted and what's not counted within the U.S.'s GDP in your formative. And that will give you good practice for when you're ready to and set for the summative for this topic. Next time, the second part of this topic, which is the math behind finding real GDP, real GDP per capita, and the real GDP growth rate. All right. Until then, take care.